She was live on air. Millions of people were watching. The cameras were rolling. The lights were blazing. And Savannah Guthrie was doing what she had done for years, holding the moment together, with grace, with composure, with that signature warmth that had made her one of the most trusted faces in American television. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked normal. But behind the scenes, something was happening that nobody in that studio could have prepared for. A phone call had come in. Not a scheduled call. Not a producer update. Not a segment note. This was something entirely different. Something that would stop Savannah cold. Something that would reach through all the noise of live television, through the earpiece, through the carefully managed chaos of morning news, and land like a punch to the chest. The people closest to her said they could see it. A flicker, just for a second. A change in her eyes. A moment where the professional mask slipped just enough to reveal something raw and real underneath. What was in that phone call? Who was on the other end of the line? And why, of all the moments it could have arrived, did it come then when the whole country was watching? What happened next wasn't just chilling. It was the kind of moment that strips everything back. Fame, career, success. All of it, gone in an instant. What was left was just a woman, a phone call, and a truth she could no longer outrun. To understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to understand who Savannah Guthrie really is. Not the version the cameras show you every morning, but the real woman behind the desk. She grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the daughter of a judge and a woman of deep faith. From an early age, Savannah carried something rare. A combination of intellectual hunger and genuine empathy. She wasn't just smart. She wasn't just driven. She was the kind of person who actually cared. She cared about the truth. She cared about people. She cared about getting the story right, not just getting it first. That combination carried her a long way. She put herself through law school. She passed the bar. She built a legal career. And then, in a move that surprised people who knew her, she walked away from law and towards something that felt more like a calling. Journalism. She started from the bottom. Obscure local markets. Long hours. Small paychecks. Learning the craft the hard way, the way it used to be done before social media shortcuts existed. She paid her dues with patience and with purpose. And slowly, steadily, she climbed. Court reporter, legal analyst, White House correspondent, each step a little higher, a little harder, a little more exposed to the world's judgment. By the time she landed at NBC, she had already proven herself in rooms where most people would have crumbled. She had covered presidential campaigns. She had sat across from world leaders. She had asked the questions that others were afraid to ask, and she had done it without flinching. Then came the Today Show, the biggest morning audience in America, the co-anchor chair beside Matt Lauer, and later, alongside Hoda Kotb, a partnership that felt, to millions of viewers, less like a professional arrangement, and more like watching two old friends start every morning together. That's what Savannah had built. Not just a career, a relationship, a daily ritual for millions of people who turned on their televisions every morning and found her there, steady, warm, a constant in a world that kept spinning faster and faster. But here's what very few people talk about. Beneath all of that, Savannah Guthrie was quietly carrying a weight that most people could not see. Professionally, she was at the top of the world. But personally, the ground beneath her had shifted in ways that would eventually force everything to the surface. And the phone call was the moment it all collided. It started with her eyes. That's what people who were in the studio that day would later say. They weren't watching her face for drama. They weren't looking for cracks. They were just doing their jobs. Floor directors, producers, camera operators, the invisible army that keeps live television running. But when it happened, they noticed. There was a moment, brief and almost imperceptible, where Savannah's eyes went somewhere else. Not off camera, not to a monitor, somewhere internal, somewhere deep, and in the world of live television, where every second is accounted for and every expression is visible to millions. That kind of pause carries weight. The phone call had not come during a commercial break. It hadn't arrived with the gentle buffer of scheduling or the softness of a private moment. It had crashed into the middle of the machine, the relentless, perfectly timed machine of morning television. and it had arrived with a force that no amount of professional training could fully absorb. Those who knew Savannah well understood she had always been remarkable at compartmentalization. It was a skill developed not just as a broadcaster, but as a lawyer, the ability to separate what you feel from what you show, to store the hard thing in a locked room somewhere inside, and deal with it later, after the cameras stop, after the studio empties, after the world has moved on to the next story. But some phone calls don't wait. Some truths refuse to be stored away. What we know is this: the call carried news about her health, and not in a vague, abstract, something to monitor kind of way. This was serious. This was the kind of information that changes the color of the air around you, the kind that makes the familiar suddenly feel foreign. Savannah had been dealing with a vision problem, something that had been creeping in quietly, the way serious things often do. A gradual dimming, a blurring at the edges, easy to dismiss at first, easy to rationalize when your schedule is relentless and your days start before the sun rises and end long after it sets. But the problem had persisted, and now the news coming through that phone was no longer something she could rationalize away. In late 2016, Savannah suffered a serious eye injury, a detached retina, after her young son accidentally struck her in the eye during play. The injury required emergency surgery, and the recovery was neither simple nor certain. For a woman whose entire career lived in the visual medium of television, whose face, whose expressions, whose ability to read a teleprompter and connect with an audience all depended on her sight, the threat of losing her vision was not just a medical crisis, it was an existential one. And that phone call, in whatever form it arrived, carried the full weight of that uncertainty directly into the heart of her most public, most watched, most unguarded moments. Here is what makes Savannah Guthrie's story different from a standard celebrity health scare. It's not the diagnosis. It's not the surgery. It's not even the fear, though that fear was real and profound, and deserves to be spoken about honestly. What makes her story different is what she chose to do with it. Most people in her position would have gone quiet. They would have stepped back, issued a careful statement through a publicist, and retreated into the privacy that wealth and fame afford. And nobody would have blamed her. The audience would have understood. Her network would have supported that choice. But Savannah didn't go quiet. She went on air. She showed up. Not because she was fearless, but because she understood something essential about the relationship she had built with her audience over all those years. That relationship was built on presence, on showing up, on the implicit promise that she would be there, honest and real, even when real wasn't comfortable. She knew that if she disappeared without explanation, the void would fill with speculation. And speculation is its own kind of cruelty. So she told the truth. Not everything at once, not in a dramatic, camera-ready revelation, but slowly, with the careful honesty of someone who respects their audience, enough to be vulnerable with them. She talked about the injury. She talked about the surgery. She talked about the uncertainty. And in doing so, she accomplished something that very few people in her position ever manage. She made her fear relatable. What the cameras couldn't fully capture was the private battle happening behind every public appearance. Recovery from retinal detachment surgery is not a clean process. It is uncomfortable and disorienting, and it comes with no guarantees. Savannah had to hold her head in specific positions for extended periods. She had to limit activity. She had to sit with the unsettling reality that even after surgery, the outcome was uncertain. And she had to do all of this while maintaining a schedule that would exhaust a healthy person. Early mornings, live broadcasts, interviews, travel. The relentless rhythm of daily television that doesn't pause for personal crisis. There were mornings, sources close to her have said, where simply walking into that studio and sitting under those bright lights required a kind of courage that no job description could ever prepare you for. Because the lights that had always been her stage were now, temporarily, her adversary. The brightness was uncomfortable. The visual demands of live television were taxing in ways her audience never saw. And yet she was there, every morning, present, professional, warm, carrying something enormous in silence, and choosing, consciously, deliberately, to keep showing up. That is the hidden truth inside the story that most people only know as a headline. It wasn't just about recovering from an injury. It was about refusing to let fear define the story, about choosing presence over retreat, about deciding over and over again that the work mattered enough to keep going. But here is where the story deepens. Further, because the eye injury was not Savannah Guthrie's first encounter with the kind of moment that makes you reassess everything. Long before the retinal surgery, long before the phone call that sent a chill through her carefully constructed composure, there had been other battles, quieter ones, less visible ones, battles that played out not on camera, but in the private geography of her own life. Savannah had married late by the standards of her generation. Her first marriage had ended, and for a long time, the question of family, of children, of the life she wanted beyond the career she had built, existed as a kind of ache she rarely spoke about publicly. She met Michael Feldman in her late 30s. They married in 2014, when Savannah was 42, and then came something she had genuinely feared might not be possible: pregnancy. Her daughter Vale was born in 2014. Her son Charlie followed in 2016. For someone who had quietly mourned the possibility that motherhood might have passed her by, these children were not just joyful additions to her life. They were something closer to miraculous, which is why the moment Charlie accidentally struck her in the eye, the moment that set the whole medical crisis in motion, carried an emotional irony so sharp it was almost literary. The child she had waited for, prayed for, feared she might never have, that child was, inadvertently, the catalyst for the most frightening health challenge of her professional life. That particular kind of irony, the kind that life delivers without warning or apology, is what makes Savannah's story resonate so deeply with people who have nothing in common with her professionally. You don't have to be a television anchor. You don't have to have millions of viewers. You don't have to have navigated the corridors of the White House or stood in the spin room after a presidential debate. All you have to have is a life, and in every life, there comes a moment where the thing you love most and the thing that frightens you most collide in a way you never could have scripted. Savannah has spoken, in the years since, about what that period taught her. She has talked about faith, deep, personal, not for-show faith that had been the bedrock of her life since childhood and that held her steady when nothing else could. She has talked about her husband, who she has described as a calm and grounding presence in a world that often rewards chaos. And she has talked about perspective, about how an injury to her eye, of all things, somehow clarified her vision. Not the physical vision the surgery was working to restore, but the internal kind. The ability to see clearly what matters and what doesn't, to stop spending emotional energy on the things that deserve none, and give that energy instead to the people and moments that actually constitute a life worth living. The road back was not linear. Nothing real ever is. There were setbacks during recovery. There were mornings of genuine doubt, moments where the professional mask was harder to put back on than usual, where the weight of everything felt less manageable than the day before. People who watched her closely during this period noted subtle shifts. She seemed, at times, more emotional during certain segments, more willing to let a moment breathe rather than push it along to the next talking point, more present in a way that felt different from her already considerable warmth. What she was learning, in real time, in front of an audience of millions, was the thing that most of us learn only in private: that strength is not the absence of struggle. Strength is what you build from struggle. And Savannah was building something during that period, something sturdier and more honest than the polished professional she had been before. She was becoming someone who had been tested and had not collapsed, someone who had faced a genuine threat to everything she valued: her sight, her career, her sense of self, and had come through it with her spirit not just intact but deepened. That doesn't mean the fear went away. Fear doesn't work like that. But she had found a way to walk forward alongside it rather than being stopped by it. And in doing so, she gave her audience something more valuable than any interview or any breaking news segment could ever deliver. She gave them a model for what it looks like to be a real human, being in an impossible situation, to be scared and show up anyway, to be uncertain and keep speaking, to be in pain and still choose warmth, The response from her audience was unlike anything she had experienced in her career. Viewers who had watched her for years wrote letters. They sent messages. They stopped her on the street, not to talk about news, not to comment on an interview, but to say, "I see you. What you're doing is brave. You helped me." And this is the part of Savannah Guthrie's story that the headline, "Savannah Guthrie Receives Terrifying Phone Call," can never fully capture. Because the terrifying phone call was not the story. It was the door that opened onto something deeper. A story about a woman who had spent her entire career in pursuit of the truth, in other people's lives, and who was now, in the most unexpected way, being asked to tell the truth about her own. And she did. With grace, with courage, with the kind of honesty that requires you to stop caring about how you look and start caring about whether what you're doing actually matters. That, in the end, is what makes Savannah Guthrie's story not a celebrity story. It's a human story, one that belongs, in some way, to everyone who has ever received a phone call that changed everything and had to decide what to do next. If this story moved you, if it made you think, even for just a moment, about the people in your own life who show up with grace even when they're carrying something heavy, then you already understand why this story needed to be told. We live in a world that celebrates the highlight reel, the award, the anchor desk, the perfect morning. But the real story, the one that actually matters, is always the one happening in the margins, in the hospital waiting room, in the private moment before the cameras come on, in the quiet decision to keep going when everything inside you is asking whether it's worth it. Savannah Guthrie made that decision over and over again, and she made it in public, which took a kind of courage that deserves to be recognized. So if you're carrying something right now, something heavy, something uncertain, something that arrived like an unexpected phone call in the middle of your ordinary day, know this: showing up is not a small thing. It is, sometimes, the bravest thing. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below. Tell us about a moment when you chose to keep going. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about real people, real moments, real courage, because that's the only kind worth telling.